Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. On Sunday the 30th of June. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by Hugh Marshall. Welcome, Hugh, founder of Talking Scotland. And
Talking Wales.
Talking Wales. This is the problem you have got with me. I'm terrible at stuff like this. So we're also joined today by Campbell Gemmell. Campbell, you're a consultant with the OECD and you're a visiting professor at Strathclyde University and you're former head of SEPA. So thank you again for joining us this weekend.
You're welcome. Good morning. Good afternoon.
So let's start the show with, again, the depressing Ukraine update, and today is day 858. Russian forces fired missiles at the town of Vilnyansk outside the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia, killing 7 people and injuring 31 others on Saturday, officials said. President Volodymyr Zelensky repeated his appeal to allies to provide Ukraine with more long-range weapons and enhance air defences to stop what he said were daily attacks on his country. The Prosecutor General, Andriy Kostan, said 2 missiles were fired on the town in Ukraine's southeast, damaging infrastructure, a shop and residential buildings. Emergency services put the death toll at 7, including 2 children, and said 8 of the 31 injured were also children. Firefighters had put out blazes in several buildings and completed rescue operations. Zaporizhzhia's regional governor, Ivan Fedorov, said the Vilnyansk strike was yet another dreadful terrorist attack against the civilian population. Occurred in the middle of the day, a non-working day in the town centre where people were out relaxing, where there were no military targets. Russia's defence ministry claimed its missiles had struck an area in the Zaporizhzhia region where it said Ukrainian trains unloaded arms and military equipment. Russian attacks on frontline villages in the Donetsk region in the east killed 4 people, according to Ukrainian officials. Ukrainian forces shelled parts of southern Russia's Kursk region throughout Saturday after carrying out an overnight drone attack on a village which killed 5 people, including 2 children, according to the regional governor, Alexei Smirnov. Ukraine and Russia said priests were among the dozens of captured soldiers and civilians they had exchanged earlier this week. On Saturday, President Zelensky said that 2 Ukrainian Greek Catholic priests taken captive in Moscow-occupied Berdyansk were handed back to Ukraine thanks to the mediation of the Vatican. Russia said a high-ranking Ukrainian Orthodox cleric was handed over to Moscow along with 2 other priests. Moscow and Kyiv exchanged 90 prisoners of war and some civilians earlier this week. Rescuers in Dnipro said several residents remained missing after at least 1 person was killed and 12 wounded, including a 7-month-old girl, after a Russian strike destroyed the top 4 floors of the apartment block in central Ukraine on Friday. So, Campbell, I'll come to you first. There seems to be a lot of mentions of civilian casualties in today's update, but is there anything that you want to mention?
You said at the start of the programme that it's depressing, and it feels like each time I've been on, we've had terrible news about the conflict and the way in which the Russians just continue to fight this out, and the Ukrainians keep defending. I think, I suppose my main observation would really be about the weariness of the world in general, given that not your good selves, but many broadcasters have really lost interest and perhaps patience, and the politicians responding to that really are not talking about it in the way that they need to. It's now almost a kind of a tiresome footnote that this is still going on. And because, of course, we've got elections and all the build-up to it in the US and France and the UK, it's easy to be distracted and not to be paying attention to this. But the loss of life and the collateral damage to all of the infrastructure of Ukraine is continuing, and it's shocking, and it's very, very hard to see an end to it. Obviously, good that other mediators in the Vatican and so forth are helping with exchanges of prisoners and trying to ameliorate certain dimensions of what's going on. But it's going on, and the death and destruction continues. It needs to be something that the global powers pay serious attention to, and I really would like to hear rather more from the mainstream and big broadcasters, but it does feel like they've kind of lost interest. They're weary. It also will play into the agenda around Russian support for politicians in other parts of the globe, and that worries me considerably. And now that we see Russia in its strategic alliances with China and also with North Korea, there are really long-term strategic issues to worry about. And that needs to be discussed front and center too. This is a big, it's a local dimension to a big global problem, and it needs to stop.
Thank you, Campbell. Hugh, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, just echo everything that's just been said. I think it's the fact that we've got so much other things going on. Ukraine has slipped down the agenda. Even I would say that what's happening in Gaza has slipped down the agenda because of domestic politics. But yeah, I think that the real danger, of Putin and Russia, as I say, the fact that he's been in North Korea, which is basically, a despotic crackpot dictatorship, shows the depths that he's willing to plummet to. And it was interesting listening to the radio this morning with talk of Russian interference in the UK elections. So, yeah, no good will come of it, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Hugh. So we'll move on to
Brian, perhaps. Oh,
yes.
I was just going to say, could I add just an extra point? I think we also should be paying attention to the fact that both in Georgia and in Moldova, there are significant issues going on, especially in Georgia, and campaigns for democracy, for freedom, and against the kind of old Soviet-style Russian intervention in their politics. Both of them have become part of the process of moving into the EU extended family. And I think that also needs to be something that we pay real attention to. Both of those states have shown serious interest in becoming much more closely aligned with the West, which of course will immensely irritate Putin and his allies. But it's something that we need to be supportive of and engage with and just aware of in this part of the world.
Thank you, Campbell. I don't think you would find many people would disagree with making that observation. It's a good one to make. Thank you. So moving on to the next routine depressing item of the day is the update for Gaza and Israel. At least 37,834 Palestinians have been killed and 86,858 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October. Gaza has, as Hugh was saying, Gaza has gone down the news agenda during the general election. However, the bombarding and killing in Gaza goes on, and in the West Bank, the IDF destroyed 11 homes, making 50 Palestinians homeless as Israel steps up destruction of Palestinian property. Hugh, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what's going on in Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, I know we're going to go on to discuss this later, but I think the fact that we saw what's happening in the United States with Trump versus Biden, and Biden's incredibly poor performance in the leaders, the presidential debate, and that's the thing with Israel. The USA is the biggest sort of lever of change and influence. Although Netanyahu does seem to be sort of listening less and less to outside forces. But if you've got a weak leadership in the United States that's inefficient and incapable of sort of making their views known to the Israeli leadership, is going to cause a problem. And it does look like as if Israel, I don't think they want this to come to an end. I think they're quite happy for it to continue, and basically try and break the will of the Palestinian people. But I'm afraid the opposite is going to be true. They're the most successful recruiters to Hamas, I would imagine, there's ever been. Really sad. I hope after Thursday that it starts getting the attention that it deserves and needs, and we can, sort of be part of, from a UK perspective, part of the solution.
Thank you, Hugh. Campbell, I hate to say, but time is against us. Is there anything that you'd like to briefly add?
Just to be aware, I suppose, again, of the geopolitical dimensions to this. It's been going on in one form or another for a very long time, but I think it does highlight the difficulties we have of actually sensibly intervening in something that is so patently wrong. The Americans build a jetty that doesn't quite work. It puts in a fraction of the sort of aid and support that the Palestinians need. The West Bank conflict is also continuing, as is conflict at the Lebanese border, and they don't really get reported. They've just fallen off the list. Meanwhile, there are talks going on in the Gulf, and you have to be hopeful that they might bear fruit eventually. But this is an incredibly difficult, intractable problem, and even a sort of breakdown in the Israeli cabinet hasn't really helped. So, yeah, it's another disaster that we haven't managed to put solutions forward for that can actually work yet.
Thank you, Campbell. So we'll move on to the next item, which is the elections in the USA. The first presidential debate of 2024 was on Thursday night, just the other evening. It showed Americans the choice they have for the next president. Will it be a mumbling, rather frail-looking Joe Biden, or a prolific purveyor of falsehoods in the name of Donald Trump? I can't imagine how I would feel if I was an American voter right now, when the planet is facing so many huge problems, and this is a choice that we've got. Biden, it seems to me, struggled to land any major blows on Trump, and the day after the presidential debate, I mean, Hugh, you mentioned that Biden didn't give a very good performance at all, but the next day, Jill Biden, the First Lady, said, Joe's not a young man, and after last night's debate, he said, Jill, I don't know what happened. I didn't feel that great. And I said, Joe, look, we're not going to let 90 minutes define the 4 years that you've been president. What my husband does know is how to tell the truth, which is a clear reference to Trump. So my question, come to you first, Campbell, is should Jill Biden, the First Lady, persuade the president not to run again?
She sounded quite like the teacher that she is and has been when she said that, and it's I find it really sad. Two candidates for global leadership, one of them current, one of them recent, effectively arguing about who has the better golf handicap and performance, rather than actually focusing on the kind of things we've already been discussing this afternoon that most of us think are important. Heather Cox Richardson, that my wife drew attention to for me, that I follow in her A Letter from an American, in her daily sort of words of wisdom, did sort of point out that it was edited beautifully by Fox in order to make it sound even worse than it was. It was bad, there's no doubt about it. We've also seen younger men, including the Prime Minister, perform extraordinarily badly, and his opposition contender for Prime Minister likewise make a bit of a cod of some of his performance. So yeah, being defined by a media debate is a pretty scary place to be. A bit like this. This is not a job interview, nor is it necessarily the best way of expressing any of our talents in a short period. But should he be persuaded to step down? What would the consequence of that be? I mean, I think a Trump victory is entirely feasible the way things are, even if he's in prison, apparently. So I do wonder about the fact that the vice president seems to be MIA. And she, I would have thought, under various constitutional arrangements in the US, could easily step into the breach. There are lots of other talented people that I've personally encountered and that we know about across the US who could potentially step up, including one or two governors. But should he step back? Well, he shouldn't have been there in the first place, would have been one of my arguments. And if you look at the vigor of an Obama presidency, even with hostile Congress, it's a kind of sad contrast with where we are now. So, long-winded response, but I suppose I don't think so. You elect an administration, not just a president, but it's a pretty sad state of affairs that the choices we are presented with, and have been arguably for the best part of a decade on both sides of the Atlantic, have been pretty inadequate, pretty second-rate, and pretty grim.
Thank you, Campbell. So, Hugh, do you agree with Jill Biden? Should we let 90 minutes define the 4 years that Biden's been president?
Yeah, well, obviously you don't define 4 years of his presidency in 90 minutes, but we're discussing the next 4 years. And I just think that there's a duty of care involved here. Age shouldn't be a barrier, but age does impact people in different ways. And it was I listened to quite a lot of the debate, and it was worrying. And I agree with what Campbell's saying. You're voting for an administration, but obviously under the American system, the president is the commander in chief. He is literally, he or she is the boss. What I find interesting is when you look at the presidential elections in the US, it basically comes down to around 6 or 7 states. The other ones are all decided on beforehand. They're either going to be Democrat or Republican. So it's those 6 or 7 key states: Georgia, Michigan, I think Ohio, and another few that are the ones that are the swing states that decide which way things go. It was interesting. The New York Times, came out, their editorial board saying that Biden should stand down, and listening to a commentator, I think on CNN, saying that there are mechanisms in place, and it was interesting. It was the Democrats who actually called for this presidential debate. It's the earliest one that's ever been. So whether that was a tactic of trying to flush Trump out in this one, or whether it was they were testing Biden. That's something that is possible. But the names that are being sort of discussed, the most interesting one is Gretchen Whitmer. She's the governor of Michigan. She's an American lawyer who is very personable, very eloquent, and would probably make an excellent candidate. But she thinks she's given her backing to Biden, but according to one of her former advisors, she does think that she could beat Trump. And I think beating Trump this time is really important, because I think come sort of for the next cycle, Trump is going to be older than Biden is now. He's going to be 82, 83. So it's questionable as whether Trump could go again, having lost twice. So defeating Trump this time is critical, I think, especially in the current political climate where we have Putin, sort of stretching his legs, and we've got sort of the elections, in the UK where sort of Reform are polling relatively well. They are in England and Wales, lesser so in Scotland, and we've got the elections today in France, which will probably see a far right sort of party winning for the first time since the far right were in control of France during the Second World War when the Germans invaded them.
Thank you, Hugh. I've got a wee bit about the mechanism about what might happen next. So Joe Biden won the Democratic primaries earlier this year, but he doesn't officially become the party's candidate for president until he's endorsed at the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which takes place in August later this year. There's no formal mechanism to replace a president or to replace the presumptive nominee, and such a move would be the first time a US political party has attempted to do so in modern times. In effect, the only option would be for Biden to agree to step aside and allow the delegates he won in the primaries, those are the people who vote, to nominate a candidate at the Chicago convention to choose someone else. He could name someone, as we both said, probably Kamala Harris, but her approval ratings are poor. And I've got some possible candidates. Hugh, you mentioned Gretchen Whitmer. Yeah, she was on the short list for vice president for Biden in 2020. There's also a Gavin Newsom, 56-year-old California governor, J.B. Pritzker, a 59-year-old governor of Illinois. He's apparently very wealthy. Sherrod Brown, a 71-year-old, would be the oldest alternative, but she's still 7 years younger than Trump if she gets chosen. And it was considered Sherrod is a he, and it was considered a surprise when he didn't stand for nomination in 2020. And then there's on the outer chances of it being chosen as Dean Phillips, a candidate during the Democratic primaries earlier this year. So they do have options. Campbell, I'm rambling now, so is there, in the last couple of minutes that we've got for this, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of things. Age definitely has to be deleted as an issue. It has to be about competence and character, and I think Trump fails easily on both counts. I think age also, youth doesn't confer great wisdom automatically either. This is about a whole set of other attributes, and I think it's an Irish kind of aphorism of not starting from here. The difficulty is that we are here, and I take Hugh's point entirely that this could have been a kind of litmus test for either of the big parties, just to see whether or not they could change where they were. I do not see a particularly smooth approach, but fans of the West Wing, as I am, know that the 25th Amendment can be used in a number of creative ways, and if there is a succession model in play, it can be used. But we need better candidates, and I think that speaks perhaps to what we're going to go on to talk about, the nature of democracy in other parts of the world closer to home. It surely shouldn't be about millionaires, billionaires, people with particularly hostile views who are anti-immigration or whatever. But that seems to be the way that our society in various parts of the planet have drifted.
Thank you, Campbell. I mean, we are pretty much out of time, but Hugh, just to give you, Campbell got 2 shots there, so I'll give you a second shot. You've both said that age shouldn't be a barrier, but I think, is it right to say that although people are talking about his age, it's just the fact that he kind of was so doddery the other night, isn't it? That seems to be the main issue, why people are asking.
Yeah, exactly. Like I say, age shouldn't be about. You look at somebody like David Attenborough, who's incredibly coherent and lucid, and you could listen to him for hours. So age isn't a barrier, and having age does bring wisdom. But it was striking. I saw the vice presidential debate from about 10 years ago, and it was incredible. Seeing a different Joe Biden. The Joe Biden today. Like I say, it was quite sad to watch.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. So the next item is the UK general election. Well, Rishi Sunak says he believes he will win the general election despite poll projections. Asked whether he thought he would still be Prime Minister on Friday, he said, "Yes, I'm fighting very hard and I think people are waking up to the real danger of what a Labour government means." Meanwhile, the Labour lead in the opinion polls is something like 20 percentage points ahead throughout the campaign. So Hugh, how much is left for Sunak to salvage in this campaign, and what would be the effect if reforms start taking votes from or splitting the votes on the right?
Yeah, Sunak's finished. He's done for. It's surprising, actually, to think about his D-Day fiasco. It feels like it was something that happened 6 months ago, not a couple of weeks back. But yeah, I think that the danger is that that the Conservative Party is damaged below the hull, and whether they can actually come back from such a defeat. Because it is quite interesting to think, thinking, oh, the Conservatives are doing badly. I don't think, listening to Vox Pops, there's great appetite for Starmer. There's great appetite for change, and in all honesty, you should, defeating this Conservative government is the easiest job going, because they have been, in the last few years, especially, an unmitigated disaster. But remember, when you look at the polls with sort of Labour 20 points ahead around the 40% mark, you've still got combined between the Conservatives and Reform 34%. So 1 in 3 people in the UK statistically are supporting this current Conservative Party or Reform. So it's a substantial chunk, and that's what we probably see in France as well today. Is a third. It's not a majority, but it's a substantial chunk. And with first past the post, that's the risk that if a party does replace the Conservatives, whether they merge with Reform and become this sort of Trumpian right, then with first past the post, come 5 years, come 10 years, they could come in, and they could sort of be running Westminster, and by default impacting what's going on in Wales and Scotland.
Thank you, Hugh. Campbell, I can't remember. Have you had a chance to go at this question yet? I've lost my track.
Not today, but I probably have before. But I'm happy just to observe that I can't imagine that there are many people in the whole of the UK that are keen to see Sunak continue. So I think a bit like the end of the Thatcher Major era, I think people will be very glad to see the back of the current incumbents. But the choice is an interesting one, and I suppose our country probably does need to be viewed in terms of all 4 nations and the different components of the politics there. I mean, we've seen Labour working in Wales, so what will Labour, after they win at the UK level, look like in Wales? What difference will that make? I'd be interested in Hugh's views there. As far as we're concerned, Labour is presenting itself as a change in Scotland, but of course actually represents a change in the UK and probably a deterioration, not anything like a positive change at the Scottish level. In Northern Ireland, I think because of the mess up over the border in the Irish Sea and the issues around the connectivity of Ireland and the continued rise of Sinn Féin, I'm not entirely sure that the Conservative demise matters all that much, but they'll want to be, as they always are, actively negotiating with the new administration to see what the Unionists can get, as opposed to what ultimately the Republicans would like to see happen. So it's a funny old picture, and England seems to be continuing on its journey towards being an anti-migration country, where Scotland and I suspect other parts of the islands are probably rather either more sanguine or positively, like Scotland, keen on seeing population growth and bringing talent in. So it's a weird old picture, but there will not be fondness remembered for Mr. Sunak as he packs his bag. I hope he loses his seat, and we'll see whether the family move quickly to the US or whether it takes them a little bit longer. But good riddance, I would have thought.
Thank you, Campbell. I suppose Rishi Sunak's got no option but to tell folk that he thinks he'll still be Prime Minister on Friday. But UK-wide, Keir Starmer is predicted to be heading for a landslide victory, but not because Labour has put forward a compelling alternative to the Tories. It's because Labour is not the Tories. So what change will Labour bring when they say they'll continue to follow Tory fiscal rules? Hugh, over to you, and do please feel free to tell us about how things are in Wales when it comes to Labour.
Yeah, I think it's I've discussed this numerous times when I've appeared here. When you look at what Rachel Reeves, who will be Chancellor come Friday, it's much of the same. And what I find as well is this comparison to sort of household economies, sort of being sort of mindful of the pennies. For me, it just shows economic illiteracy. There are alternatives. We know that the cuts that the Conservatives made, under the guise of austerity, it wasn't for financial reasons. It was, it was what they wanted to do. They wanted to reduce the size of the state, because that's what Conservatives tend to do. But it's interesting when you think that in Wales, the discussion has been going on about Barnett consequentials from HS2. So just as Scotland has, got Barnett consequentials for rail. So of the money that's been spent on HS2, Scotland has received a Barnett consequential. In Wales, it's different because we haven't got the consequential on rail, which means we've actually Welsh taxpayers contributed 2.5-3 billion towards HS2 without an inch of the track sort of appearing in Wales. So this was part of, you go back a couple of years, Labour policy, we should be getting this money back. But now, surprise, surprise, Labour have recalculated what the sum is, and it's a couple of 100 million rather than the 2.5 billion. So, they will be moving the goalpost because they know that the money isn't there. What's interesting from a fiscal point of view is Labour have refused to commit to anything, basically, until they know exactly, what's left in the coffers. Which I think is slightly disingenuous. They know exactly, the financial situation that they're going to inherit, but their honeymoon period is going to be very short. In Wales, where Labour are in charge of, health and education, through the Barnett consequentials, we get the highest sort of funding per capita of the four nations, and yet education and health, I got the worst performance outcomes of the four nations. Yes, it's been chronically underfunded. Everything's been chronically underfunded. But if you're still having to manage something, you have to manage that well. And when there isn't money, it's even more critical that you're able to manage that. And from a Wales level, they haven't been able to do that. I would imagine, Labour, they're going to have a much deeper pool of talent. They've parachuted people in, and some of them, Torsten Bell, from who's looked at the economics. He's been parachuted into Swansea, for example. But I'm sure he'll actually sort of, do it, be able to sort of add to what's going on within the Labour Party, because they're going to have a lot of new MPs there. But it does worry me in general that that they are quite sort of fiscally right wing, and what change they'll do. But I think what will happen, and it looks like it, is the economy is going to improve, I think, much quicker than people expected, and Starmer and Sunak is going to be looked at and thinking, why on earth did he go for an early election? If the economy is going to be seeing, real signs of growth, but come, November, December, it's showing just how bad his judgment is. But yeah, looking forward to a bit of change. But fiscally, you know, I am concerned because, you know, local authorities here, we're looking at cuts in education at the moment, and unless those, you know, holes are plugged, you know, we're looking at lots of people losing their jobs.
Thank you, Hugh. And so for you, Campbell, what will change look like when Labour simply plans to follow current Tory fiscal rules?
Yeah, I mean,
Me.
it's really hard to imagine what it will look like other than very much the same as is right now. Labour have obviously been trying, whilst pushing change as a soundbite with absolutely nothing underneath it that we can grapple with, they've been managing expectation to try and not have a galloping demand from the punters. But I agree with part of what you said in terms of inflation coming down. He managed to get it on target, and I presume that was probably the flag that went up for calling the election. And we've also seen very small signs of very modest growth, but we've still got the highest ever national debt. And they keep borrowing, and that keeps going up. And we've also got the highest tax burden ever. And so the talk of taxes being cut is very much about further in the future cuts actually being applied, and cuts to taxes means cuts to public spending, and therefore we will see a huge deterioration, continued deterioration in public services. And apparently that's what England wants to vote for. I'm not entirely sure that anybody else wants to go down that path, but that's what we're going to get. And the decline in population ratio, both for Scotland and for Wales, means that the Barnett consequentials become worth less and less. So we earn our money and we get less of it back from Westminster in its decreasing largesse. So I think it's going to be really, really tough and quite ugly. And unless Scotland is on a different path, which perhaps we're coming to, I don't see it feeling at all better in Scotland. Although we might have a bunch of different faces, some of which are, dissembling faces from the past that Labour has managed to, put forward for constituencies that they think are winnable, because people are tired, and they're tired of the SNP in much the same way as they might be tired of the Tories in the south. But it's a very bad call when there will be very, very few benefits for Scotland and considerably greater damage yet to come that's essentially in the pipeline because of what the Tories have done.
Thank you, Campbell. And just very quickly, because we're almost out of time, and I've lost my statistic, but the Labour Party, Labour have been getting a lot of funding from a gambling company whose name I can't remember. I mean, tens of thousands of pounds. I'm sorry, could you repeat? Bet365 have been funding Keir Starmer ever since. Bet365 have been funding Starmer ever since he was standing against Jeremy Corbyn for the leadership of the Labour Party, and they're continuing to fund the Labour Party now in the run-up to the general election. So does it look like the only people that are really going to win here are going to be the gambling industry? Hugh, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, what are the odds on that? And I think it's interesting, obviously, from a Welsh perspective. Gambling has been a big story with Craig Williams, the Conservative special advisor to Sunak, and I think that's what's blown it up. But yeah, no, I think it's the fact that it's not just sort of gambling firms, but just the amount of money that comes from different lobbyists into Labour. We've seen sort of same things around health as well, and it's unhealthy the way that companies can influence politicians. So when we look at Wales, the Vaughan Geth thing, we had to vote of no confidence in him as a First Minister because he accepted £200,000 from a convicted criminal who's been convicted of environmental sort of dumping offences. So again, what do these people expect for their money? They're not doing it out of out of the goodness of their own heart, or there's you always expect something in return, and that's for me that concerns me. All of this kind of money should be stripped out of politics. They shouldn't be allowed to accept money from external sources.
Thank you, Hugh. And as I say, getting Campbell, we're pretty much out of time, but we've had a lot of gambling gate has been in the news a lot lately. But and I know that funding is an issue with the SNP's ongoing investigation. But is it worth drawing a comparison between Labour taking money from the gambling industry and wealthy donors, and the Scottish National Party seems to be only funded from membership dues? Is that right?
Yeah, I think I don't honestly know the forensic detail of party funding, but it does seem from what I've garnered generally that we've drifted again into an American style funding model, and we need to really work out what we want here, because I don't believe that significant amounts of money are given by Israeli donors, donors from the defense industry, oil and gas companies, private healthcare outfits, and they don't expect anything. And it's very odd and worrying to see the Labour shadow cabinet, several members seem to have received significant funds from private healthcare, and it fits with Wes Streeting's agenda around the private sector taking on a greater role, and essentially the future privatisation of the health service. Is that what Labour voters are voting for? Have they really thought about it? I do wonder. And obviously there's a scale thing. The SNP is a much smaller party with a smaller membership. Constraints on the amounts they could actually bring in, and therefore what they can actually spend on campaigning, etc. And to have Labour being able to spend their money in Scotland at a larger scale, I think is in danger of being highly asymmetric. So should we be funding this at a state level in order to make sure that there is not that kind of influence, overt or more subtle, by those who put money in? I mean, everybody can't end up in the House of Lords, although it does seem like the House of Lords just keeps on growing because there are so many bills to be paid in terms of who received money in politics and therefore what they deserve. So yeah, it's hard not to be cynical, and I suppose my punchline is that it does lead us towards a plague on all your houses, and it'll be really interesting to see how that's reflected in turnout at this election, more so than perhaps before. How many voters do actually vote with their feet, whether or not they've managed to get their postal vote in or turned up at the booth. This is a very strange election in a number of ways, and I think it will deserve to be looked at closely, and there may well be those kind of pointers about future funding, future limits, future behaviours that we might want to look at.
Yes, and I wonder how many people will get turned away if they don't have the correct photo ID on them when they go to vote this time. So I've heard some people say there should be a cap on how much parties spend, and I don't think the big parties that get the big donations are going to ever bring that in, which brings us to the general election in Scotland. So John Swinney all this week has been saying repeatedly that the result of the election in England is a foregone conclusion. The Labour Party has a commanding lead, and it is certain Sir Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister. The only story left in this election is Scotland, where it is hotly contested between the SNP and the Labour Party. So if Labour looks like they're winning a landslide in England, how should voters in Scotland vote to get maximum influence for Scotland? So Campbell, I believe it's your turn to go first this time. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's difficult to have a complex answer to this, because to me all of the unionist parties face south, and therefore I don't see that they have any real chance of representing or even taking Scotland's interests seriously. So it does leave us with the parties that are actually based here. And in terms of the likelihood of winning seats, there's only one that would make sense. So for me, it's pretty straightforward. And whilst I suspect there might be many voters who will hold their nose to do that because of concerns that they might have, it's still the least worst choice, because pretty much all the other choices are either delivering the same as we've had, or something called change, which will be worse than what we've had, but will look different for a while. It's really a pretty tough choice for the electorate, which takes me back to the point about turnout and just exactly how it plays out. But in any event, it doesn't seem to me to be a very difficult choice for anybody who's thinking intelligently about Scotland. There is no way that as we've moved from 70 to 50, whatever, MPs in Scotland, that the votes really count at the UK level, especially if there's a 200 majority for a Labour Party or thereabouts. So Scotland's votes don't matter. We're effectively cannon fodder for the English majority. Therefore, I think to be noted, to be taken at all seriously, there needs to be a very large vote for a Scottish party, and there are not many of them.
Thank you, Campbell. And so, Hugh, I'm wondering, John Swinney's take on this, that there is still a fight to be done in Scotland. It's not, okay, Labour's going to win nationally, but in Scotland, the SNP are still in with a chance. Does that land in Wales at all? Do you hear that down there?
No, I think cause what you see is it's interesting because obviously in Scotland you've had the SNP sort of government for I think 14 years. In Wales we've had 20 odd years of Labour government, and you can't say it's been a success. On any sort of metric that you look at, but obviously they're benefiting from the UK anti-conservative feeling, and Labour are going to do well. They're going to do well in Wales. They're going to do well in Scotland. And if you're an incumbent party, it's really hard to compete against something, especially when people don't, still can't make the connection between funding from Westminster and how a government in Wales and Scotland can function. Although we can criticise the Labour government here in Wales, they are restricted by the money they receive from Westminster, but that's the same in Scotland. And it's interesting that Scotland, has been used by Starmer as, we need to end, sort of fought the years of chaos and the Conservatives and chaos in Scotland with the SNP, where I would, suggest that on almost every metric, the SNP government in Scotland has performed better than the Labour government in Wales, but that isn't mentioned. But I think what's going to be interesting, though, on Friday there'll be 671 days until the elections in Holyrood and in the Senedd in Cardiff. And I think that is where there's going to be the big difference, and especially if Labour fail to deliver on their promises, then there's a real chance they're going to get a kicking at those elections in Scotland and Wales.
Thank you, Hugh. And so again, we've run out of time really, but just really quickly, the first page of the SNP manifesto is filled with just one sentence that says that a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence. But what if you're a voter and you're really more interested or you're more concerned about the economy and the cost of living crisis? Should Scottish voters vote for a Westminster party or the SNP? Campbell, quickly, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose I've covered it to some extent in that if Labour is effectively promising more or less the spending strictures that are already baked in from the Tories, I don't see why that would be in Scotland's interest to vote Labour. So again, for me, that's pretty straightforward. It's a promise of something that isn't actually deliverable in Scotland by Labour. But the SNP have a difficulty, obviously, in that this is not an election for Scotland. This is an election for the UK. So it'll be interesting to see whether, for example, if Sinn Féin does very well, will they change their position on taking seats in Westminster? I think for many of us in Scotland, it seems like it's pretty pointless, no matter how many MPs there are for Scotland from whatever party, if they are effectively just part of the background in the Westminster context. So that first page of the SNP manifesto, I suspect, still makes a lot of sense to quite a lot of people in Scotland. So let's see what happens. Thank
you, Campbell. And again, Hugh, quickly, I know that you're for independence in Wales. You see yourself ever being tempted to vote for Labour because of things like the cost of living crisis rather than Plaid Cymru?
Well, this is a from a Westminster perspective. Who's going to sort of speak up and challenge the government at the time? So, if we, as Wales going down from 40 to 32 seats out of the 650. So our voice is going to be diluted even further. Yes, I can see the logic of saying, well, the more Labour MPs we have, then we can actually have change in Wales. But it's England who decides, which government we get, what colour it's going to be. So it's a free vote in Wales and Scotland to vote for parties that you think are going to better represent you. So actually, what is the point of sending more Labour MPs and fewer MPs who are actually there because they're there standing up for Wales and Scotland?
Thank you, Hugh. So, next question really is about how well has media coverage, particularly television reporting, reflected and analysed support for the different policies and parties. Just thinking about TV coverage, I've got a couple of examples here. So, BBC Question Time on Thursday there, Fiona Bruce finally challenged Farage directly about Reform candidates making blatant racist comments. And Hugh, I don't know if, and Campbell, I don't know if either of you have seen, but Martin Geisler on BBC Scotland in the past few weeks has redeemed himself with the same, by asking the same question quite forcibly to both Anna Sarwar and Douglas Ross, asking if it's a voluntary union, what is the route for Scotland to achieve independence? Also, there was recently an incredible front page on the Daily Record that was had all the previous Tory prime ministers from Cameron right through to Rishi Sunak with devilish red eyes, saying that this election is about poverty, it's not about independence, it's about spiralling mortgages, soaring bills, cost of living crisis. Change is coming and Scotland can be part of it, so for the first time in 2010 we're asking our readers to vote Labour. But generally there seems to be a long list of things that just don't make it into the media this general election. Hugh, I'm rambling again. Rescue me. What do you think about the coverage?
Yeah, well, it's because it's interesting. The polling suggests that the four most important topics that people consider when they'll be voting on Thursday are health is number one, economy and cost of living was second and third, and immigration fourth. So things like education was 10th, and the environment, was sort of low down as well. So the media has been driving this narrative, discussing subjects without giving, for me, proper balance. For me, it was quite telling. I watched I think it was the ITV debate the other night, and the co-leader of the Green Party was on. It was the first time I'd ever seen him. I didn't know what he looked like. So the fact that you've got a co-leader of one of the main parties in the United Kingdom, and I'd never seen him before. I'd heard him on the radio. That just lets you know about the way things are going. And it's been very much focused, on Starmer and Sunak. It's almost like a presidential approach. But it's like I said, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with Talking Wales, and that's why Broadcast Scotland is important. It's important to have more voices that are able to challenge and discuss politics. Particularly on a national level in Wales and Scotland. But because the UK media, it is basically pandering to 84% of the electorate who live in England, and it's understandable that they do that. But that is always going to be a problem.
Thank you, Hugh. Campbell, have you been impressed with the media coverage so far?
No. Next. It's been pretty depressing, to be honest, and the fact that the BBC in particular just loves Farage has been depressing for more than a decade, and the way in which there is a lack of fairness in the not just the distribution of time, the number of times people appear on Question Time, the fact that it seems like La Bruce has to interrupt everybody to a degree, but the SNP more than anybody else, because it's usually an unbalanced situation where there's 4 or 5 voices from the Union and one representing Scotland or whatever. So it's been a thoroughly disappointing affair. I agree with you. I think there's been that sort of presidential trend towards the 2 main party reps, which may make sense in the English context, but it's not the way in which the UK, I think, actually should see itself. It doesn't represent the diverse voices, etc. So I think the media duties, both in print and in broadcast forums, have not really been discharged very effectively at all. I don't think there's been detailed, constructive discussion. As you also pointed out there, for me, I think the absence of consideration of the climate crisis, of anything to do with the environment, despite the fact that England's rivers are essentially dirtier now than they've been for the last 60 plus years, it's just shocking that is not a subject of serious attention. I think also there has not been decent coverage of national debt, the borrowing levels that have been achieved. The fact that Brexit was, you can actually use the B word for quite a long time, despite the fact that it's closed off or made difficult access to the largest market for capital goods and people. And Starmer proudly being allowed to sort of say that he doesn't want to see a customs union or any other moves towards a more favourable relationship with Europe, other than saying he wants a favourable relationship with Europe. What does that mean if you don't actually then follow it through to the details? So the media has not held those politicians' feet to the fire in terms of getting real answers to the big policy questions, and we've already talked about the geopolitical stuff that also hasn't been covered. So I think the media have done really badly. Bless you. I think yourself and Linda especially have done a fabulous job. I think Hugh's doing a great job. There need to be many voices and better, properly funded voices that come from other parts of the forest rather than the right-wing media. We've had enough of that. So there are serious lessons to be learned, but I'm not sure that they will be, because it doesn't suit that broader agenda. It doesn't follow where the money actually is coming from in contemporary politics. So I'm afraid again that's rather depressing, but that's how I would view it. The media have not done well in this election. We might have heard more, but we haven't heard better. And it hasn't really helped to make it a serious discussion about the things that ought to matter to the broader community.
Well, thank you to both of you for your kind words for Broadcasting Scotland. It's much appreciated, and I really would like to have asked you both about who's to blame about the poor media coverage. Is it the politicians and their answers, or is it the format that the broadcasters decide upon? And maybe it's a bit of both, but we really are out of time. So thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Campbell, again for giving up a substantial chunk of your weekends for us here today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We're focused on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding, and we depend on your support to be able to pay our bills every month. And finally, just a wee reminder that this Thursday evening coming, we're starting at 10 o'clock. Join us through the night for Scotland Counts with live coverage of the election results in Scotland as they come in. But once again, thank you to Hugh and to Campbell for joining us, and thank you to you at home for watching. Bye.